Welcome back. We're going to move on in this lecture to talking about phonemes and allophones, so the pieces that hold meaning in a system and the pieces that don't. And so what we'll start with is describing what phonemes and what allophones are. So phonemes are the smallest unit of sound that distinguishes meaning in a language. And one of the easiest ways that we can determine if something is a phoneme or not is to look for words that are pronounced almost the same. So if two words are pronounced the same except for one sound, those two words would be, those two sounds would be separate phonemes of the language. So if you think about how this is evidence that the sounds are distinct, it's the only sound that's changing, and yet the meaning, the interpretation of that word is changing as well. So that sound is contributing to the meaning. It doesn't hold meaning on its own, but if I use one sound instead of another and it creates a different word that has a different meaning, it's contributing to that meaning and it's giving me a different word as a result. And when we have sounds that are examples like this, when we have two words that are almost the same but different by only one single sound, this is what we would call a minimal pair. And minimal pairs are the easiest way for us to determine if there is separate phonemes in a particular language. So for instance, if we look at some examples in English and we have the word lap and we have the word lip, the only difference between these two words is the ah or the I sound. And yet it means something different. So this tells us that ah and I are separate phonemes in English. It's the only difference between those words, so it has to be distinct in that language. If we look at lap and rap, this is different only by that very first sound, so our ah and our p sounds remain the same in both words, but the ol and the are different and create a completely different word that means something different. So this shows us that L and R, our ol and sounds, would be separate phonemes in English. And then if we look at one with sounds at the end, lap versus lab, the difference between these words is just that final sound, either a P or a B sound, and yet they mean something completely different. So this shows us that P and B are separate phonemes in English. And again, these are always going to be specific to a given language. So in English, these are separate phonemes. We have words, examples of minimal pairs, that are different only by that individual sound. And that shows us that those sounds have to be distinct phonemes. And it can happen, as you can see, in any place in a word. It doesn't have to happen at the end of a word or the beginning of a word. It can happen anywhere. And we can look at some examples of how this can happen between sounds and sort of moving through. So if we have head and bed, the only difference between this is the h and the b at the beginning. So this tells us that h and b have to be separate phonemes. In bed and bad, it's only that middle vowel that's different. So and a, separate phonemes in English. Or bad and bat, the only difference is that final sound. So our d and our t sounds would be separate phonemes in English. And we've seen some examples of this already in the phonetics examples. So when we think about thigh and thy, these are two words that are spelled very, very differently, but they're pronounced almost identically. The only difference in pronunciation between these is that first sound, whether it's voiceless or voiced. So we know that in English, our th, our theta sound, and our the, our eth sound, have to be separate phonemes because it's the only difference between these two words, and they mean something different. So again, spelling doesn't help. We want to look at the phonetic realizations of them, but that first sound is the only distinction, and it creates a different word. So these would be minimal pairs and show us that the voiced and voiceless version of our interdental fricatives are separate phonemes in English. So when we're looking through, we can do this with just a pair of words. All you need are two words that have that different sound, and then you know that those different sounds have to be minimal pairs. But we can have entire sets of words. So lots of times our words that rhyme can be examples of minimal pairs, or if you have several, a minimal set. We'll typically just use the term minimal pair, even if there are several. But in a set like chalk, talk, dock, jock, shock, we know that in English, because the only difference between all of these is that first sound, that t, sh, ch, d, and j would all be separate phonemes in English. And sometimes we can see pairs here, right? So we have a voiced and voiceless version of several of these. We have t and d, we have ch and j. But then when we're looking at this, what about sh and zh. And if you try to think about a minimal pair for sh and zh in English, I usually ask you to spend a moment and think about it. But the trick is that we don't actually have a true minimal pair between these sounds in English. But yet, we can still have evidence that these are different phonemes in English. So even if we don't have a minimal pair, we still have ways that we can find out if they are separate phonemes. And so we have what's known as a near minimal pair. So we do have a near minimal pair between sh and zh. So in the words pressure and pleasure, they are not exactly identical, but the environments that we find the sounds in, the sounds that come directly before and after, are the same. So that's, each of these words starts with a p. There's a liquid sound. There's an e. We have either our voiced or our voiceless post-alveolar fricative, and then we have that syllabic r at the end. So the environment that surrounds the phonemes we're looking at, whether it's sh or zh, is exactly the same. So they're both coming right after an s sound and right before a syllabic r sound. And anytime we're looking for an environment, it's always the segment that's immediately before and immediately after whatever sounds we're looking at. So in this case, even though we don't have an exact minimal pair, they're showing up in the same place. We can't predict where it's going to happen. So we know that because they can show up in the same environment, that's similar to a minimal pair, this is also evidence that we have separate phonemes. So if we look at an example from Hindi, Hindi is a language that is spoken in India, and when you'll notice a diacritic as little h that's sort of a superscript, and this just means aspiration. So aspiration is just a little puff of air that occurs after some obstruents, and we'll talk about that in our synchronous class with some examples that we'll be looking at to dive into this further. But if we look at a set of sounds and we're comparing our P sound and our B sound, note that we're only looking at the ones that aren't aspirated right now. Do we find a minimal pair specifically between those two sounds? So remember, when you're looking for minimal pairs, it has to be between the sounds that you're looking for. If you find other ones, that's not really helpful for the point of the question you're looking at. But in this example, you can look and you can see that we have pal, take care of, and bal, child. And the only difference between those words is the P or the B sound. So that does give us evidence that these are separate phonemes. They distinguish the meaning of take care of from child. But then if we go back and look for other distinct phonemes, and we try to compare our unaspirated and aspirated P, our unaspirated and aspirated B, and then the two aspirated plosives, you may notice that you're going to find other minimal pairs between them as well. So between P and aspirated P, you notice we have pull moment and pull fruit. Between B and aspirated B, we have bal child and bahal forehead. And then the two aspirated ones we can find also between bahal forehead and pal knife blade. So we have separate phonemes for each of these pairs, meaning that all four of these sounds are distinct. They are all separate phonemes in Hindi. So that is the easiest way to determine if we have separate sounds. But we're not always going to find that when we're comparing sounds in languages. Not all sounds are separate phonemes in a language. Not every sound that exists in a language is going to contribute to meaning. Sometimes you're going to find sounds that don't have minimal pairs because they're only produced certain times. They're only found in certain environments, in certain cases. And this is what we would call an allophone. So an allophone is just an alternate pronunciation of a phoneme. So it's not a separate sound in the system. We just pronounce it a little bit differently because of the sounds that it's coming next to. So these tend to occur in a phonological environment based on the sounds that are before and after it, that's causing the sound to change because of the sounds that it's next to. And these are always going to be predictable changes. We can write rules, and we'll talk about that in some lectures next week, that can describe what the change actually is. So you won't find minimal pairs for allophones. You're instead going to look at the environment. What are the surrounding phonemes? What are the surrounding sounds in which the allophone is occurring to determine if you have a separate phoneme where it shows up in the same environment, or if you have allophones which will never show up in the same environment. They're always going to be in complementary distribution. They're never going to show up in the same place as the other pronunciation of that phoneme. So to give a slight visual for thinking about this distinction, phonemes are their own individual sounds. They have their own identities. They have their own way of being understood. So Superman and Batman can show up in the same place at the same time because they're two separate things. They have their own identities. They can be in the same place at the same time. Similar to the sounds that we were seeing with minimal pairs, they can be in the same place and they mean something different when they're in that same place. Allophones, on the other hand, will never show up in the same place at the same time. They're just variations on the same sound. So similar to Superman or Clark Kent, you're never going to be able to find them in the same place at the same time because they're just variations on the same person. So they're never going to appear in the same environment as the other one because they can't. They're the same thing. They just look different, or in the case of allophones, sound different than the variation that you might see in other environments. So when we're going through to try to determine, do I have phonemes, do I have allophones, when we're comparing different sounds, there's going to be some certain steps that we're going to take. And in our synchronous class, we're going to talk specifically about how to go through this. We're going to have a lot of examples to go through. But I'll go through the steps, we'll do one quick little practice, and then in our synchronous class, you'll have tons more examples and a chance to practice this together and ask questions, talk through the different steps, and really get some practice in before you have to do anything for an assignment so that you can get some actual hands-on practice as well. One of the first things that you want to do if you think you have allophones is to ensure that you're getting the correct analysis by drawing a chart of what the sounds environments look like. And I'll show you a view of what that looks like in a moment when we look at our practice problem. But you're going to use that environment that we were talking about, which consists of the sound immediately before and the sound immediately after whatever you're looking at. So in the word cat, if we're looking for the environment of k, that first sound, what you're going to notice is that there's no sound before it, so we use a hashtag or pound sign to represent this is a word boundary. There's not actually a sound here. So the sound before, nothing. So we put that pound sign there. The underline, the underscore, is to represent where the sound you're looking for would go. And then the sound that's coming after, you would put after that underscore. So the environment for the k is a pound sign, the underscore, and then the ah sound. If we're looking for the environment of ah, then you'll notice the sound coming directly before it is k, so we put that first. We have our underscore to represent the sound we're looking at, and then we have a t at the end because that is the sound that comes right after. If we're looking for the environment of t in cat, we notice that right before it is an ah sound, so we put that ah symbol. We have our underscore where the T would be, and then there's no other sound after that in the example, so we would put a pound sign or hashtag there because that's a word boundary. So it doesn't matter if it's the start or the end of a word, that pound sign or hashtag just indicates there's no sound there because that's the end or beginning of the word. So keeping that in mind as we're drawing environments, as we're thinking of environments, we'll go through all of the steps to take. If you're given a data set, so we had our Hindi data set that had minimal pairs, but if you're given a data set, you do first always want to check for minimal pairs. And the reason is because if you find minimal pairs, you're done. You don't have to do a chart. You don't have to do anything else because you have evidence that they have to be phonemes. So if I'm looking at P and B in Hindi, I find Paul and Bal, I know that they're phonemes, so that would be my evidence. I don't have to go any further. But if I don't find minimal pairs, this is where I want to start drawing a chart of the sounds environment so that I can cleanly see what environment they show up in. So with our near minimal pair of pleasure and pressure, they still came in the same environment, so they were still separate phonemes. So you want to look for if you have identical environments on both sides of your chart, because if you do, they can show up in the same place, they can be in the same environment. So this is also evidence that they're phonemes. However, if you don't find minimal pairs, you don't find an exactly identical environment on both sides, then you probably have allophones. So now you want to look for the pattern. What is the pattern? Where do I find this sound change happening? What environment triggers one sound to happen versus another sound to happen? And typically what you'll find in these data sets is that one column is going to be much more predictable. You can look and see a pattern much more clearly than the other column. And so when you're looking for that, you want to look at, well, what are the sounds before and after? What can I predict? What can I describe about those sounds? And so I want to describe it once I have something that is more patterned than another sound. So if I'm looking at voice fricatives and voice stops, and I have my chart, I have my data, I might find out that, well, I'm only seeing these fricatives whenever they're in between vowels. There's always a vowel on both sides. So I would say, well, this is more predictable. So our voice fricatives are occurring between vowels. And then our voice stops, the other ones we're looking at, don't seem to have a pattern. They have all these other sounds they're next to. Maybe they're at the beginning or the end of a word sometimes, but not always. If that's not predictable, then we would say these voice stops occur everywhere else. These are the non-predictable ones. This is the underlying phoneme that I have. And then the one that is predictable would be my allophone variation. So if we look at an example in Greek, we'll compare k and k, so our k and c. And then we'll also compare h and h, our x and then our c with the tilde, the mark at the bottom. And you'll notice that several of these sounds we don't have in English. So anytime you have a sound not in English in these data sets, I'll list it out in a note for you. So the x is a voiceless velar fricative, the lowercase c is a voiceless palatal stop, and then the c with the hook is a voiceless palatal fricative. They'll still show up on your IPA chart, you'll find them there. But we don't have them in English, so I'll always describe them for you to help. So if we look through this data set, and we're looking at k, the k, and k, the c, you'll notice that we're finding those in that first column. So we want to look for first minimal pairs. And if you look just down that first column, you'll notice that there are no minimal pairs between the k and the c showing up. There's always different sounds, there's something different each time. And then if we look at the second column with h and h, with our x and our hooked c, again, you'll notice the same thing. So our first steps are, do we have minimal pairs? We don't. So the next step is going to be to draw a chart. So when we draw that chart, it's going to end up looking like this. So you take the k and the k, our k and our c, and you put them into a little 2-column chart. And then you write each of the environments that you find it in underneath the one that corresponds to it. So where that underline, that underscore, would represent that k in each of those situations. And this gives you a clearer picture of saying, okay, well, these are all the environments that I see a k in. This other column are all of the environments I see a c in. And then we can do the same for that other pair we're looking for. And then we can start looking at that chart. So if the next step is to look for identical environments on both sides of the chart, we're looking at one chart at a time. You'll notice that the left column, K, never has the exact same environment as the right column, C. Same thing with our other chart. So this tells us that we have allophones, and now we need to figure out a pattern of where we're finding these sounds. So as we try to come up with a rule that's going to explain this, we know there's no minimal pairs, and we know that drawing a chart, there's no identical environments. So now we have to move to determine, well, which one is more predictable? And if we looked at the chart, if you go back and look at the chart, you'll notice that the first half of the environment, the sound that's coming before, isn't actually helping us because both of those sounds can occur at the beginning of the word. So that's exactly the same. That side isn't giving us any information because it's not distinct. So we're only looking at the sounds that are coming afterwards. And in that case, the C and the hooked C are a little bit more predictable. So they're always coming before a vowel, but E and A are both front vowels. And then the other ones are just not front vowels. There's mid and back vowels that are present. So there's more difference, there's more variation in that other one than what you see in the vowels that are coming after the C and the hooked C. So this means that our underlying phonemes, the ones that we can't predict as easily, would be our K and our X sounds. And then when we think, well, what do these sounds have in common as we're trying to think about them as one single pattern? We know that K and H, our K and our X sounds, are both velar sounds. And then we know that C and our hooked C are both palatal sounds. So they share features. And then the difference that's happening between them is going from the velar sounds to the palatal sounds. in those specific environments. So we can describe this by saying, well, we start with our velar sounds, but they're becoming palatal sounds every time we find them in front of a front vowel. So when they're before a front vowel, we would end up with palatal sounds instead. And this is a very natural thing to happen in a lot of languages. So even in English, we do this sometimes. So if you say the word car, ka, 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 you have a velar sound there. But if you say the word key, key, we're actually making a palatal stop there. We're actually making a palatal plosive because the next sound that's coming after, that E sound, is so much further front in our mouth that it's a lot harder to go from a velar sound to a front vowel than it is to go from a palatal sound to a front vowel because your tongue is already moving towards that vowel. So it's a natural thing that's happening just because of the movement that needs to happen in our mouths. So that gives you just an idea of some of these examples. We're going to practice a ton of these in class. You're going to have a chance to ask lots and lots of questions. You probably have tons of them. And so we are going to work on this in our synchronous class. So if something is pressing, send me an email, schedule office hours, and then bring those questions, bring those things that you're still not sure of to our synchronous class. And we're going to have a lot of time to practice and understand these concepts better as we talk about it sort of in person, not person, but in Zoom. So bring those questions, think about the concepts, remember those steps that need to be taken in these different data sets because we'll be using that over and over again. And then you'll have handouts that you'll have available for you to bring to class that we'll be using as additional practice so that you can get some more understanding of these concepts.